Hi, welcome to the seventh lecture of our cycle. In the last lecture we have seen the age of the Lombard conquest and the works of Saint Gregory. Pope Gregory died in the year 604, and this brings us to the 7th century, a century in Italy almost devoid of literary expressions of any kind. Probably the most devoid one among the last 25 centuries of the history of Italy. To talk about the 7th century means really to face up to barbarity. And we will do that because this will help us to understand the Middle Ages and how the last part of them were a period of great economic and cultural recovery. In the 7th century, however, the night is dark in Italy. The setback created by the Lombard invasion becomes fully apparent. After the works of St. Gregory, we do not find a unique situation for Italy, any written cultural expression for nearly half a century. Eventually, in the year 642, we have the life of Saint Columba, written by a monk of the monastery of Bobbio, Jonas, a work with serious conceptual and expressive limits. For what concerns the Lombards, the darkness is complete. For about 75 years from the invasion, we do not have any written cultural expression. Of that period, apart from an echo of their predations, we have from the Lombards almost only their names and a few words from their extinct language, Lombardic. We know about 2,500 of their names, and they tell us something about the ghosts that lingered in the minds of Italy's new masters: Agilulf, fear-inspiring wolf; Aistulf, raging wolf; Aripert, bright in the army; Arioald, senior in the army; Garibald, valiant with a spear; Liutprand, sword of the people. We could go on with such examples. The Lombards' names evoke fearful totemic animals: the wolf, the bear, the boar, the eagle, or they mention weapons: the sword, the spear, the arrow, the shield. Those fierce names form a striking contrast with the Latin first name of the time: Candidus, Clarus, Justus, Gratus, Letula, Servulus, etc. Names that seem to suggest meekness, as if this quality appear useful to the parents for helping their children to live a long life. Also, many words that passed from Lombardic into medieval Latin and then into Italian refer to the exercise of violence. Guerra, meaning war, which became the Italian guerra; tregua, meaning truce, which became the Italian tregua; Canfio, meaning fighter, champions, which became the Italian campione; raub, meaning robbery, which gave the Italian verb rubare, to steal, and the collective noun roba, stuff, things. Even the Italian verbs arraffare, to snatch, and germire, to grab, came from Lombardic. Let's say that there are reasons to believe that the personal experiences of Italy inhabitants somewhat helped them to memorize those words. In general, the 7th century is full of battles, sieges, rebellions, murders. If enemies were not killed after power fights between Lombard kings and dukes, they were blinded. Blinding a defeated enemy was seen as a way of sparing him his life. Many rebel dukes suffered this treatment. The battles were against the Byzantines, of course, and against the Franks, who invaded frequently parts of the peninsula without managing to occupy them. Those battles were against the Avars as well, who invaded Friuli in the northeast of Italy. Occasionally they were against Slavs, Saxons, and Bavarians. But most of all, those battles were fought among Lombards, opposing the king to a rebellious duke or to a potential usurper. It was a history full of sound and fury, but which not much has remained, because not much could be constructed apart from the consolidation of the Lombard kingdom and the erosion of the territories of the Exarchate. In the year 636, the assembly of the Lombard people elected another strong king, Rothari. He conducted victorious military campaigns. In one of them, he conquered the whole Tyrrhenian coast from northern Tuscany to France, ending the Byzantine presence in northwestern Italy. In a particularly bloody battle on the river today called Panaro, he inflicted to the Byzantines a crushing defeat in which the Exarch himself was killed. But the ruling of Rothari was characterized by a more important fact, which deserves our attention. For 76 years after their arrival in Italy, the Lombards had lived without written laws. Then, in 443, Rothari obtained the People's Assembly's approval for his edict. The Edictum Rothari is a collection of 388 articles of law, which give us precious insights into the Lombard society. To this collection, other articles will later be added by other Lombard kings, 9 of them by Grimoald, 153 by Liutprand, 14 by Rachis, 22 by Aistulf, and a few others by the Dukes of Benevento. All these articles form the Corpus Legis Langobardorum, a substantially consistent corpus which gives us insight in the society of the Lombards. Those laws will remain in force for most of the 8th century as well, and in the Duchy of Benevento even longer. But let's now have a look at them. A first element that strikes us in the Edictum Rothari is that the source of the laws is the assembly of the people in arms, or the assembly of the spears, as the Lombard called it. It used to gather outdoors in a wide fenced area, and its members used to express approval by clashing their spears on their shield. Even today, who has lived in Germany and worked for a fairly large corporation knows that it is fairly common to express collective approval for a speech by knocking vigorously on tables, a gesture that never fails to shock my Italian compatriots not familiar with it. It was from this assembly, gathered in Pavia in 643, that Rothari got his edict approved. No other Germanic people respected so much the power of the assembly as the Lombards. Even their kings were expression of this body. Such had been Authari, chosen by the dukes after a decade of self-rule. Such had been Egilulf too. It is true that the former Duke of Turin had been chosen by Queen Theodelinde, but only after she had been authorized by the dukes to make her choice among them after the death of Authari. Rothari himself, former Duke of Brescia, had been elected by the assembly. Even when the Lombard monarch obtained the throne by violent means, they normally sought later on the approval of the assembly. The role of this assembly in the election of the kings marked an important difference with the Franks, who had a purely dynastic succession mechanism. And in fact, in spite of the cultural limitations, the Lombards had several very capable kings, whilst the Merovingian kings were frequently unfit for the business. The assembly of the spears was the custodian of the tradition of the Lombard people. As we know since the Germania of Tacitus, the Germanic peoples chose their kings by the nobility of the blood. In over 200 years of their domination, the Lombard kings belonged to only very few dynasties because when a duke aspired to the throne, it was important for him to belong to a family of kings. The dukes were also judges. They not only approved but also contributed to the formulation of the Edict of Rotary. Another noteworthy element is that the edict is in Latin. It is not the Latin of some Italic jurist miraculously survived until the 7th century. No, it is really the Latin of the barbarians, which is neither the vulgar Latin, not the literary one. It is a Latin written by people who ignore the syntax and part of the lexicon, but who presumed, after having read a few Roman laws, to express themselves in the literary language. Many Lombardic words have been included in the edict to name unknown concepts unknown to Roman law. Other words were clumsily translated into Latin and are not always easy to understand. The language of the edict gives us a measure of the decadence of Italy under the barbarians, even before we focus on its content. So the conquerors had to resort to the language of their subject for writing down their own laws, although the articles of the edict are dry and apodictic. It is likely that the Lombards were unable to write down their own language at all, outside of a few elementary messages. Some inscriptions on objects donated or bequeathed, a few short epigraphs, a few rough graffiti. After more than 200 years of Lombard domination, no single document in Lombardic has survived, not even a single sentence, which could give us some idea of the syntax of this Germanic language, which became extinct in the 8th or 9th century. But let's now come to the edict's content. The compilers of it had certainly read a few Roman laws. For instance, norm of the Corpus Juris Civilis. The prologue of the edict includes a sentence copied and pasted from Justinian's Novelle Constitutiones, out of its appropriate context. However, the use of Latin must not cause any misunderstanding. The Edict of Rothari is the document of a Germanic civilization. The edict consists, as its epilogue clarifies, in the first written version of the ancestral customs of the Lombards, and in some new stipulation made necessary by the needs of the people. The edict has its own order and logic. It moves from the most serious crime to the least serious one, leaving large room for civil and family law, and ending with a few procedural norms. Firstly, we note the very limited application of the death penalty for freemen. It was inflicted only for political crimes, typically acts of lese majesty, and for the most serious crimes in a society that regarded itself as an army: collaboration with the enemy, military sedition, abandonment of a comrade on the battlefield. For other crimes, even very serious ones, the Lombards had the weregild and the composition. The weregild is also called weregeld, where the first part of the word is equivalent to the Latin wer, man, and geld is the same word used in modern German for money. It was the price for a man's life, to be partly paid to the family of the victim and partly to the king as a compensation for the offense that the crime had caused to the whole community. The composition was also a pecuniary sanction for less serious crimes paid to the offended parties. Sometimes composition is also called by extension weregild. In the edict, we are far from the precision of the Roman law. The Lombards applied those monetary sanctions to a wide range of offenses, not only to murders but also to injuries, aggressions, unintentional damages, calumny, and even simple insults, which in a society with a high sense of honor could cost very dearly. In order to explain the extent of pecuniary sanctions among the Lombards, we have to keep in mind that the Edict of Rothari dealt with the problem of the feud. from the Lombardic word faida, meaning hostility, the eternal curse of tribal societies. Germanic societies were based on the strong role of the extended family, including a very large number of relatives. Any offense to a family member obliged all the relatives of the victim to a retaliation, which frequently caused an escalation in violence. And how to avoid then that many lives would be upset or lost because of the inconsiderate act of someone? The Lombards had centuries of migrations behind them. They had never had the chance to conceive detention facilities that could segregate a perpetrator from the community offended by his crime. Unless he was executed, but the capital punishment was very rare among free men in Germanic society, neither the king nor the dukes had any effective means to ensure that he was isolated from the rest of the community. There was therefore the need to heal the wound caused by the crime without triggering the destructive mechanism of the feud. To this problem, the Lombards answered with the Weregild, and in his edict, Rothari states that he has intentionally set the amounts for Weregild and composition for acts of violence higher than they used to be, in order that, so the words of Rothari, the feud, i.e. the hostility, ends once it has been settled with money, and nothing else will be required, that the crime will be extinguished and the controversy ended and friendship restored. After the Weregild had been paid, no act of revenge was tolerated. If revenge was nevertheless taken, it was punished in the harshest way. The Weregild was a very high sum, a clear deterrent to any potential offender, set in golden solidi. The edict detailed the amounts in relation to the various crimes, revealing a lot of the economy and the society. It is not clear what happened when the person convicted was unable to pay the Weregild, i.e. whether he was abandoned to the revenge of those he had offended. For sure, the consequences were dire. Articles of law later added by King Liutprand stipulated that if the unpaid Weregild was above 20 solidi, the convicted man became a slave for the rest of his life. Otherwise, the offender became a sort of temporary slave who could regain his freedom by his work. If the offender was already a slave and could not pay, which was practically certain, the punishment was death. The amounts of the sanctions depended not only on the kind of offense, but also from the position of the victims, the size of the families, the functions in the community, etc. The hard society of the Lombards was divided into three main classes. On top, there were the Freemen, i.e. the Lombards who had reached adulthood, which happened to come quite early, at 12. For the Lombards, the concept of free man coincided with the right to carry weapons and of being a member of the army. Only the free man had full legal rights. The protection of his life and property was the primary concern of the Lombard legislature. At the top of this elite were the king, the dukes, and the gastals. We have dealt with the dukes during the last lectures. The gastals were officials appointed by and reporting to the king. When, after a decade of anarchy, the Lombard dukes had decided to elect a king, each of them had granted to him half of his property in order to create a solid basis for the king's power. Officials were needed to manage those immense estates, and these were the gastals. They became more and more important as the power of the monarchy grew with the time. The gastals had civil, martial, and judicial powers as dukes, and as dukes, they were involved in the drafting of the Edict of Rothari. Besides the Freemen, there were of course the Lombard women. The weregil for offences to Lombard women was not lower, and in some cases it was much higher than for offences to Lombard men. However, Lombard women, as well as minors, were subject to the mundium, a term meaning protection. The Mund was a Germanic institute defining the disciplinary powers of someone over the members of his family. It implied the duty to defend the weaker member of the family, for instance, in a judicial duel, and especially the honor of the family from the offenses that other people might have caused to the weaker member. It also entailed the right to ban a family member, for instance, in cases where his imprudent behavior could have caused feud. Ubies mundium, ibies dominium, or ibies pertinentia, explain the glosses to the edict. The bridegroom had to buy the mundium from the father or the brothers of the bride and pay for it, although the price was lower than that of the weregil. If a woman lost all her male relatives, the mundium on her was exercised by the king. No Lombard woman could be self-mundia, states the edict, and neither any other woman, in fact. The second class of the society was that of the Aldi, plural of Aldius, a Latinized Germanic word meaning senior. The Aldi worked for the Lombards, while the Lombards were at war or trained for war, hunted or engaged in political activities. The Aldi were frequently bound to the land that they farmed without owning it. They were in charge for various economic activities necessary for the daily life of the Lombards, without having the hope of ever integrating themselves with their masters. They did not have political, not military rights, but they could marry among themselves, have children, and own some goods, among which slaves. The clear separation between the Freemen and the Aldi was made evident by the weregil. For Freemen, the weregil was a huge sum of several hundred solidi, a sum to be precisely determined by the magistrate in accordance with the status and the role of the victim in his family and in the society. For an Aldius, however, the weregil was a flat amount of 60 solidi. To simplify a bit, the Aldius was the descendant of the colonus of the Roman Empire after the reforms of Diocletian and the predecessor of the serfs who will populate the countryside during the rest of the Middle Ages. Serfs bought and sold together with the land that they farmed. Finally, there were the slaves, the third and lowest social class. They were objects more than human beings. They were, according to a famous Aristotelian definition, tools with voices. They had no rights and could not own goods. Legally speaking, they had no family. They had no parents either. If they were killed, the weregil ranged from 15 to 50 solidi according to the value that they represented for their master, to whom it was paid. If a slave caused damage to someone, and his master had therefore to pay a composition for it, the master could reduce the amount of the composition by having the slave killed, and the reduction was close to the average value of a slave. Being a slave was an appalling fate. But even among slaves there were some differences. Slaves belonging to the state were somewhat protected as property of the crown, whilst rural slaves belonging to private people, frequently to the Aldi, enjoyed no protection whatsoever and must have been often treated like pet animals. The Lombards had always had slaves during their migrations before reaching Italy. This was true for all barbarians. Defeated peoples provided them constantly with this commodity. In the case of the Lombards, their fittest slaves had at least a faint hope to gain freedom. Sometimes, before a great battle, the Lombards used to set some of their slaves free in order to increase the number of combatants. Freedom came at a risk, but it was anyway a chance for those unlucky men. On the other hand, slavery was also present in Italy before the Lombard invasion. Centuries of Christianism had not got rid of it. People tend to associate slavery with the ancient world, but in fact, slavery continued to exist during the Middle Ages. Although production activities based on huge numbers of slaves had ceased to exist, like the mines of the Roman Empire, the commerce of slaves remain a lucrative business and went on even after the Middle Ages, although it more and more affected people of different religions. In the early Middle Ages, slaves were employed in smaller numbers at the time, but they were numerous in the society. They were employed both in cities and in agricultural activities. Even the monasteries had slaves. Paradoxically, freeing ecclesiastical slaves was very difficult because this would have constituted alienation of church property, an act strictly forbidden since the earliest ecumenical councils. What the Church had done, particularly with St. Gregory, was to underline that Christ had died for all human beings, including slaves, and that slaves had to be respected as Christians. Furthermore, thanks again to St. Gregory, the Church had started to encourage the manumission, i.e., the freeing of slaves, mainly by recommending it in last wills. With the conversion of the Lombards to Catholicism, many of them freed their slaves before dying. Other slaves were freed because a Lombard man wishing to marry a slave woman had first to free her according to a specific ritual in front of witnesses. It was only with the Catholic kings of the 8th century that the conditions of the slaves began to show signs of improvement, reflected by articles of law approved under Liutprand and Rakis. The marriage among slaves started to be somewhat protected by the law. Slaves were allowed to take oaths, etc. It was a very slow tendency towards an improvement of the slaves' conditions, entirely due to the action of the Church. So these were the three social classes of Italy under the Lombard domination. The analysis of these laws poses us a question. How is it possible that a people so nationalistic as the Lombards did not mention in the laws the inhabitants of Italy, among which the Lombards lived as a very small minority? It is true that the laws occasionally mention the Romans, but as we have seen last time, this was how the Byzantine called themselves. And this was therefore an expression used for the inhabitants of the Exarchate, citizens of another state. What about the Italians living under the Lombards? There is a possible answer, unfortunately. The Italians were never free men. They were aldi whenever they were not slaves. Therefore, once the law had regulated the relationships among the three classes described, there was no need to mention the inhabitants of Italy with reference to their ethnicity. When, in the course of the 8th century, some Italians will finally achieve the freeman status, it was because they came to be considered Lombards and as such members of the army and capable of having legal rights and obligations. However, those cases were few, and after almost 200 years of Lombard dominations in Italy, almost inevitable, I would say. The laws of the Lombards tell us many other things about Italy during the 7th century. Very far from the word familiar to us. We learn a few things by the value of the goods, reflected by the amounts of the compositions and by the contracts that have survived in notarial deeds. The compositions were determined in monetary units, the solidi. What were they? They were gold coins, very scarce in Italy during the 7th century, and they had a great value. Buildings and lands were cheap instead, because the population had been since long decreasing, and because the general insecurity reduced the number of transactions, and especially of those transactions concerning goods that were investments in the future. The Lombards made a large use of notaries public. Their deeds show value relations unfamiliar to us. For instance, in the year 718, a whole grove of olive trees is sold for 8 solidi. A few years later, 2 horses are sold for 50 solidi. In another case, a single horse is purchased against 5 hectares of land, half a church, a vineyard, and a grove of olive trees. Horses had a huge value for people dedicated to war and raids. Several articles of the Edict of Rothari are concerned by the property of horses. The value of slaves and aldi do not come out so well from the comparison to the value of horses, as the amounts of the compositions in the edict show. For instance, who had cut a horse tail, diminishing thereby its beauty and causing offense to the owner, had to pay a composition of 3 solidi. However, 3 solidi was also the composition for having caused the traumatic abortion of a slave, to be paid to a owner, naturally. The prices of slaves were normally lower than those of horses. A young boy costed 12 solidi, a young mother with her infant child 21. Even if slaves were abundant, their prices somewhat held, because human beings in general were scarce with respect to the land. The value of plots of land was so low that they sometimes exchanged against quantities of millet, lard, or other edible commodities, a sign of economic decadence and insecurity about the future, hardly conceivable in our times. Economic activity was almost entirely confined to agriculture, largely aimed at self-consumption. Olive trees, grapes, apples, pears, nuts, chestnuts, a bit of sheep farming, hunting, a bit of beekeeping, some mills, some woodworking, in which the Lombard must have had some skills, possibly an echo of their Scandinavian origins, because several of their words linked to carpentry eventually passed into the Italian language. Among farm animals, pigs were predominant, as they were suited to heavily forested areas. Also, monasteries had their large pig farms, an important source of wealth for them. Apart from the social classes and from the economy, the laws of the edict tell us other things about the society and the beliefs of the Lombards. An echo of the hard life in the 7th century reaches us through the Mundeburdium, an institute by which an aldius or an impoverished Lombard, having no means of getting food and clothes, put himself under the protection of someone by handing over to him all his belongings and obliging himself to services and acts of reverence for the rest of his life. This institute might have been connected to the protection that, in the classical world, used to be granted to a freed slave, a libertus, who sometimes continued to live with his dominus almost ever as a member of his family. However, in the Italy of the 7th century, this legal institute was not linked to a benign manumission. The act was often the consequence of the loss of the means of subsistence by someone, and it implied for him the loss of freedom for the rest of his life and the loss of any inheritance for his children. The spread of this kind of voluntary serfdom might have been eased by the predations suffered by the Italian population in the years following the Lombard invasion. As economic inequalities grew with the time, many Lombards were affected as well by these conditions. Another echo of the times is apparent in the norms that mention magic and sorcery, concepts that found no space in Roman law. For instance, Article 368, which deals with judicial combats, forbids the champion to carry magic herbs. And Article 376 deals instead with the habit of killing witches. No one should think about killing an aldia or a slave of someone else, how indicative this specification, as a witch. A Christian mind cannot possibly conceive that a woman could eat a man alive from inside. The Winili had from immemorial times their own naturalistic paganism, which led them to worship trees, water sources, and certain animals, as we have seen last time. 5 centuries before invading Italy, they had changed their name into Langobards or Lombards and had converted to the cult of Wotan, more suited to the state of war in which they found themselves after pursuing a nomadic life. After they converted again to Christianism, the Lombards found in Italy, in the figure of the Archangel Michael, a substitute to their warlike god, Wotan. The Archangel was venerated in a sanctuary on Mons Garganus in northern Apulia, where an ancient temple dedicated to the seer Calchas had previously stood. The formidable Archangel, armed with his sword, became the protector of the Lombards, replacing Wotan and his pair. The main promoter of this cult of the Archangel was the Duke of Benevent, Grimoald. Grimoald, I will talk about him in the course of the next lecture. But such stratification of naturalistic cults, Germanic paganism and Christianism, coexisted in the Lombard society. And thanks to the capacity of agricultural society to preserve traditions, they survived for a very long time. My great-grandfather, who lived in the countryside of Lombardy, used to tell that still at the beginning of the 20th century, certain old farmers had the habit of taking off their hats when they walked past some old oaks. It was a gesture that documented the survival of some of the beliefs of the Winili, against which the church had been fighting for 2,000 years. Also, the belief in witches was widespread among Germanic peoples, and they managed to transfer it somehow to the church, where it stuck, silently nurtured by the medieval obsession of the devil's presence. This belief will have appalling consequences 1,000 years later, when the processes against witchcraft became common during the 16th and 17th centuries. So these were in summary the laws of the Lombards, which are the best way to know their society. That's why we talk about them. But how were they applied in practice? No analysis of a legal system is complete without mentioning the work of the courts and how controversies were solved in practice in the society. This will lead us to talk about the very interesting institution of the ordeal, very important for understanding the Middle Ages. But we've said enough for today. We will deal with that in the next short lecture, which will complete the picture of Italy during the 7th century. We will also talk about a few interesting Lombard kings next time. Now, thank you for your attention and see you soon.